Good morning, or good afternoon, I should say, and welcome to this ITIF webinar on how states can make the most of broadband funding. My name is Joe Kane, and I am the Director of Broadband and Spectrum Policy here at ITIF. Closing the digital divide has been a central goal of communications policy for decades. In November of 2021, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act was signed into law. The IIJA allocates over $64 billion to broadband deployment, a majority of which is allocated to the Broadband Equity, Access, and Deployment, or BEAD, program. In addition to the IIJA, broadband is getting several billion more dollars under the American Rescue Plan Act, and existing broadband subsidy programs administered by the Federal Communications Commission and the Department of Agriculture continue to shell out billions every year. With so much funding in the air, we should all get the sense that this is the big opportunity to close the digital divide once and for all. We can't afford to waste this opportunity, so it's imperative that states pursue funding strategies that will make the most of available funds. Here at ITIF, my colleague Jessica Dine and I recently published a report available on the ITIF website in which we proposed 10 suggested commandments that states should follow to ensure that they find the right deployment projects and then make sure those projects are actually completed and bring connectivity to consumers. Today, we'll have an opportunity to take a deep dive into those topics by hearing from individuals who are directly engaged in the task of operationalizing recent funds and turning them into high-quality broadband for citizens throughout the country. We'll start with remarks by Evan Feynman. Evan is the director of the Broadband Equity and Access and Deployment Program at the National Telecommunications and Information Administration. Prior to joining NTIA, he worked for the Commonwealth of Virginia, including serving as the governor's chief broadband advisor from 2018 until he joined NTIA earlier this year. Evan has agreed to take some questions after his remarks, so I encourage you to submit questions using the Slido link with the code at the bottom of the screen, which is also on the ITIF event page. Now, over to you, Evan.
Thank you so much, Joe. I really appreciate it, and thank you for hosting this event. It's really important that we help to get the message out there about what we're doing with the BEAD program and how we're doing it. I want to start just by establishing, what this program is, which is an incredibly exciting generational opportunity to really change the conversation around broadband access and the digital divide. And I to underscore that, I'm gonna read y'all a quote from President Biden. We're making sure that every single American has access to high quality, affordable, high-speed internet. When I say affordable, I mean it. Americans pay too much for internet service. We're going to drive down the price for families who have service now and make it easier for families who don't have affordable service now to get there. I think that's really important because it underscores the goal of this program. We're not simply chipping away at the problem. We're not getting a few more folks online. Rather, we're solving this problem in a final way for all Americans. And so, if there's a single silver lining to the COVID pandemic, it is that we all have come to agreement, I believe, in this country that we need to expand broadband, but to emphasize just why every single American needs a high-speed internet connection, it's an economic requirement. For communities to continue to grow, they absolutely must have ubiquitous home and business high-speed internet connections. It's a political and social demand. When you talk to folks who live places where they don't have access to the internet, this is their top priority. This is what they want. And if we are going to be a good and effective government and society, we need to make sure we're meeting people's needs. But finally, it's a moral and an ethical obligation. The simple fact is there is one standard of living that is enjoyed by a majority of Americans, and then another that is the standard of living for folks who are not connected to high-speed internet. Worse, the ills related to that lack of connectivity accrue to the most vulnerable members of society. So it's the elderly who are less able to age in place. It's the reduced post-secondary outcomes for pre-K through 12 students. It's people in need of telehealth and telepsychiatry services in rural inner city areas who can't avail themselves of those offerings, who suffer the most as a result of this lack of connectivity. So it's incredibly exciting and an amazing privilege to be a part of the program that is going to solve this problem for once and for all. Well, how are we going to get this done? Partnerships. And I want to emphasize that this is not a program that is top-down, directed out of this office in DC. Rather, this is about partnerships between the federal government and state government. States are really contemplated as the prime actors within this program, but also partnerships between both the state government and local governments and the state government and internet service providers. And all of those partnerships are incredibly important if we're going to be successful in implementing this program. The BEAD program is one of the 4 different programs that were assigned by the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law to the National Telecommunications Information Agency. That's $42.5 billion for a program that gets all Americans online and then also increases adoption and other digital equity efforts. There is also a $2.75 billion program that is our mainline digital equity program. That's going to come out in 3 phases, but will dramatically increase the amount of digital equity programming that's being offered across the country. The tribal program was an ongoing offering by NTIA, but it was also plussed up dramatically in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law to the tune of $2 billion. And opening literally next week for application is the National Competitive Middle Mile Program, which is a $1 billion program. What we're going to talk about mostly here today, though, is the BEAD program. All eligible entities for this program are encouraged, and we're going to be working on ensuring that they apply. I want to be clear that the only grantees of this program are the 50 states and the 6 territories. Then each of those states will develop plans by which their subgrantees selected to build the projects that are going to get every American high-speed internet and to support the programs that are going to increase adoption, increase digital literacy, increase digital entrepreneurship, and support affordability efforts across the nation. There are a number of critical timeline items that you should know about. First is states and territories are required to get us. I'm mostly going to try to say states and territories. For folks in the territories, I apologize. I will sometimes just say states. States and territories are required to get us a letter of intent indicating that they plan to participate in the program. That has to be delivered to NTIA through our grants portal no later than July 18th. They then, by mid-August, have to get us a budget by which they describe how they will spend the $5 million of planning and capacity funds that are available to each state and territory as they begin to build out for this program. Over the 270 days following receipt of those funds, states and territories are going to develop the first cut at what their plan to get to universal coverage looks like and what their plan to improve digital equity looks like in their state or territory borders. That is really the 100,000-foot view. That's saying every question does not need to be answered in the context of that 5-year plan. Rather, we want to see where you have unanswered questions, how you intend to approach those unanswered questions. Then FCC will be releasing its data maps. Those maps are an incredible undertaking by our colleagues at FCC. Most people in this space are familiar with the deficiencies of previous broadband coverage maps. This new attempt is much more granular. It is going to be a map that will identify every single home and business location in the United States. That is going to be it's a tremendous undertaking by FCC. They are the first to admit that the first release of those maps will not be perfect maps. Fortunately, citizens and states and industry actors will be able to engage in the FCC challenge process to improve those maps. And that's going to be really important because those maps are going to drive our allocation of funds across the various states. So, how will that funding be distributed? Well, every state, the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico have a minimum allocation of $100 million. The Virgin Islands, Guam, American Samoa, and the Commonwealth of Northern Mariana Islands each have a minimum allocation of $25 million. We've also set aside 10% of the $42.5 billion, so $4.245 billion, for very high cost locations. And so we're still working out exactly how we're going to define those in partnership with a bunch of other folks. But in essence, we're going to take that 10% and we're going to multiply the number, your individual state or territory's percentage of the very high cost locations against that 10% of the funds, and we'll distribute those. The remaining funds will be distributed according to a very straightforward number of locations in any given state or territory's borders that are unserved times the number, against the remaining funds that we have there. Once that funding comes out, an initial proposal by a state is due to us within 180 days after that funding amount is received. This is the much more granular. This is more like the 5,000-foot look, because at this point, for this stage in a state's planning, we should have a very clear idea of what the subgrantee selection process will look like, who is eligible, who is not, what affordability and other requirements exist within each state's purview. And then 365 days after we approve that plan, the final proposal is gonna come to NTIA. That proposal is after they've already built their subgrantee selection process and run it. Here is the output. Here are the specific projects that we would like to serve. These are the projects that we believe are going to accomplish the program's goals. One of the things that I think is really important about this program relative to other programs is the degree of transparency and collaboration that's going to be required over the course of the program's life. We have as a requirement for states and territories to receive these funds that they be in ongoing collaboration with a diverse set of stakeholders. Every single political subdivision and tribe must be given the opportunity to submit a plan for state or territory consideration. Every single one of those same entities must be given the opportunity to comment. And this is not a traditional standard notice and comment. Rather, this is about ongoing collaboration in the development of the plan requirements of the projects that are developed, and then ultimately the final plan. There's also going to be a very strong requirement that all the diverse stakeholders are brought to the table. And so that, of course, includes the folks we were just talking about, tribal and local governments, but this also includes state agencies, community anchor institutions, communities of interest. We've got to have multiple mechanisms for outreach. So not just posting something on a state website, but rather listening sessions, public meetings, websites, social media. And there has to be transparency really living throughout the spirit of this program. And we want to make sure that transparency is not a passive transparency, but is active. We want to reach out to and underrepresented and underserved communities that have historically seen barriers to access to these programs, and make sure that everybody's at the table as we figure out how we're going to solve this problem. In support of states and territories, NTIA is hiring staff across the country. So nearly every state and territory will have a full-time dedicated staff person on the BEAD team who will be there to both communicate concerns and priorities of stakeholders back up to our office and to the state broadband office, as well as support the state broadband office in implementing these programs and developing these plans in a way that makes the most sense for them. A couple of other items that I think folks should think about. The BEAD program promotes fair labor practices, and that's really important. So there must be compliance with federal labor laws, and we want to promote the creation not just of jobs, but really good jobs through the building of the projects that we're going to do. It offers the opportunity to invest in workforce development. This is a sector that we know is growing, and that we know there are going to be a lot of good jobs created. And then finally, in something that's relatively new in this space, there's a requirement that states and territories undertake a climate resiliency review. That doesn't mean that every asset has to be hardened. It doesn't mean that states and territories need to do a better job than anybody else of predicting the future of our climate, but rather we want to see states and territories thinking about, and subgrantees thinking about, all right, we're likely to see increased storms in this area. We're likely to see melting of permafrost in that area. We're likely to see sea level rise in this third area. What's the smartest, most cost-effective way to ensure that the networks that we're building are going to be reliable and are going to continue to serve the communities that we've built them to serve over the long haul? There are a lot of different ways for different stakeholders to engage in the process. If you're a telecom provider, you certainly want to be thinking about how you can engage with your state and territory broadband offices as they develop each of these plans. You want to make sure that you apply to be a BEAD subgrantee when that opportunity is available. If you're a tribal government or a local government, you need to start collaborating with the state office as soon as possible. You also want to make sure you, as with the telecom providers, are getting in touch with NTIA staff and joining coalitions as they're created in each state in support of the program. If you're a community anchor institution, it's a huge priority that we get all of you really strong service, but you have to identify yourselves. It's not the case that the federal staff or state staff are necessarily going to know the nature, location, and current connectivity status of every community anchor institution. We need to know that so that we can support you in getting included in the plans. If you're a community organization, we want to make sure that you're involved in the planning as well, especially the creation of scoring metrics and other criteria that will go into the digital equity programming space. And then if you're an individual, there are a lot of different opportunities for you to connect to the program. We certainly want your input. We want you to connect with your local government as you consider where and whether these plans work well for you. And then finally, if you are any other member, if you're a member of any other sort of membership group or community group, we want to make sure that you're supporting our efforts and that you've got a really clear understanding of what this program is doing and how it's going to serve the needs of your community. The last thing I'll say is there's a prioritization schedule in each state, and that's going to affect the degree of work that occurs in each state. So first and foremost, every single state and territory is going to have to show us that they're going to get every single unserved location online. That means every single location below 25 megabits per second download and 3 megabits per second upload. Then as a second priority, and these are in priority order, not in temporal order. All of this can happen at once, to be clear. But then we're going to want to make sure that every single underserved location is served by infrastructure adequate to get them over 100 over 20. So that'd be everybody between 25.3 and 100 megabits per second download and 20 megabits per second upload. Then every community anchor institution needs to have a gig symmetrical service. Then funds that remain after all of those priorities have been accomplished, or when we have assurance that there are adequate funds to accomplish all of those priorities, additional remaining funds under the each state's allocation can be spent on digital equity efforts that can take a wide variety of forms. We have a list of potential eligible forms for that, but we also want to see states, territories, and community partners getting creative about what it is that their communities and the members of their communities need. That was a really quick overview of a really complicated program. I hope I've explained it adequately, but I'm eager to get into questions and answers.
All right, thanks so much, Evan. And as a reminder, you can use that Slido link on the bottom of the screen with the code that is there to post your questions. I'll start out with a question, which is, you're talking about all these different requirements. Does NTIA, we have some states are really experienced with deploying broadband and assisting in public-private partnerships and that kind of thing. But a lot of states are not, or they're really small. They don't have broadband offices. How is NTIA sort of addressing that difference in capabilities there?
Sure. No, that's a huge concern and something that we've thought about from the inception of the program. And so, first, what I would say is that letter of intent freeing up $5 million for capacity and planning is hugely important for those states and territories that don't have robust capacity within their state broadband office. What we want to make sure folks have the ability to do is really confidently implement this program, and we're going to support them every step of the way. The primary means by which we're going to support them is by those state staff. Their job is to ensure the success of the states to which they've been assigned. They are going to be frequent fixtures. They are going to be speaking to community groups. They are going to be liaising between local governments and the state government. They're going to be working with stakeholders both in and outside of the industry, and they're going to be lending the weight and expertise of NTIA to each state and territory as it approaches all of these complicated questions about how they're going to solve this problem. The approaches that each state and territory are going to have to take are going to be pretty different. There isn't a one-size-fits-all approach that's going to work. That's in part why previous one-size-fits-all approaches haven't, right? There's still millions of Americans who are not connected to the internet. Rather, this program contemplates very broad guardrails so that Alaska can implement an Alaska solution, Puerto Rico can implement a Puerto Rico solution, Arizona can implement an Arizona solution, and Delaware can implement a Delaware solution. Those are all going to look pretty different, and we're here to make sure that people navigate the wisest course between those very broad guardrails. And I also want to say, if people see an aspect of the program that doesn't seem to make sense or doesn't seem wise to members of any given community as they try to figure out how to solve their connectivity problems, if you look in the Notice of Funding Opportunity, the legal document that establishes the guidelines for the program, it is littered with opportunities for us to waive X, Y, or Z requirements. We simply have to be persuaded that that's the smartest way to solve the problem. Well, that's what we want to do. We want to be driven by practical considerations to get every single American high-speed internet. That's the goal. All other considerations fall by the wayside in front of solving this problem in a final fashion.
Thank you. We have a question now asking, how does technology neutrality requirement of the IIJA square with the fiber first prioritization of the NOFO? What about fixed wireless, satellite, et cetera?
Sure. So what's going to wind up happening at the practical result of each state's plan is that every state is going to have to take a different approach toward how it gets every citizen online. And that's going to vary based on the density of any given state or territory, the topography of any given state or territory, the current level of connectivity, the existing networks that are already there on the ground, and ultimately how challenging it is to solve this problem with the amount of money that each state and territory has. And so what we contemplate doing is supporting states in driving the first priority option, the fiber option out as far as it makes sense, and then switching to other technologies that are also great providers of broadband, but on one factor or another, fall somewhat short of the desirability of fiber from a life of the asset, from a speed, from a reliability standpoint. And so we're certainly going to wind up using, in a practical sense, we're going to wind up using all of these different technologies to get to every American. It's not going to be the case that this program contemplates building fiber to the home to every single location in the country. That wouldn't be feasible even with $42.5 billion. But what we do want to do is get the best connection possible to each location that sees a new connection or an improved connection as a result of this program.
All right. Another question here is, you mentioned funding for adoption as well. Do you anticipate a shift toward adoption efforts as the program develops? And what's the breakdown there?
So I don't know that we necessarily see that as a temporal thing. I want to be clear that well-constructed plans will have enough reserve in each category that they'll be able to move forward with all these efforts at the same time. I don't want to suggest, for example, that we're first in time going to connect all the underserved or all the unserved folks before we start connecting underserved folks, right? And we're not going to wait until we've done all that before we do community anchors. Rather, this should all be able to proceed at once. I think adoption's a really important portion of this work. I think it changes the underlying economics of the networks that we're building. It's also important that people be given the tools they need to make use of this new infrastructure that we're giving them. And I think there are a lot of different ways and forms that those digital equity efforts can take. It can be digital literacy classes, it can be outreach, it can be affordability, it can be digital entrepreneurship, it can be additional teleeducation. It can be a wide variety of different forms of outreach. One of the things we certainly want to see states and territories do is work with community partners so that every member of a different community gets access to the benefits that this program is providing. And so sometimes by community there, I mean county, right? There could be a rural county, and we want to make sure that the plan, when it's put out, it goes in front of a town hall meeting in that county, and we make sure that every location is getting service on the infrastructure side. Sometimes it's going to mean a small community of interest that maybe speaks a different language that's not often catered to by government programs. We want to make sure that we're getting them the information they need so that they can take advantage of the offerings the state is doing and everything in between. There's a really wide gamut of opportunities for states to pursue what makes sense for them and their citizens under the digital equity umbrella.
Yeah. Okay. Another question is, asking about supply chain issues that are sort of ongoing. What if there's a run on skilled labor and specialized equipment that is necessary to design and build networks?
So there is going to be, right? We know that's already happening. We can see that in the industry. We're trying to mitigate that as best we can. So, one thing to think about is that workforce training efforts are an eligible expense under the BEAD program. And so we should be able to begin churning out additional workers in this space. There are efforts ongoing across government to try to address both workforce shortages and supply chain issues. And so we're going to continue to work with folks. We're also not unreasonable. So, we contemplate building these networks as quickly as possible. As possible means, when you've got the folks and the stuff to do the construction, right? And so if there's a delay that's outside of the control of a grantee or subgrantee, that's not okay, but it's something that we understand, and it's something that we would work together with those entities to try to solve.
All right. Another one on you mentioned NTIA staffing up for this. How is that hiring process going? When will it be complete?
It's going pretty well. I deeply appreciate the Congress having a sense of urgency and setting some shot clocks on when the program needed to launch and when we needed to get going. That didn't necessarily fully contemplate the challenge of federal hiring and onboarding folks and getting their security clearances through. And so we're in process of staffing up now. I anticipate a near full team by the end of the summer. I would ask for some grace from folks in individual states and territories between now and then, as we onboard staff and get them up to speed, if we could have had everybody on the moment the NOFO launched, we would have done that. It's simply not the case that we've been able to identify, interview, and then move through both the hiring and background check portions of that federal hiring process immediately. So it's taking some time, but we do anticipate a full team by the end of the summer.
All right. So maybe if there's anyone watching right now who's interested,
reach
get
out.
in touch with Evan. Yeah.
We've got a good number of folks identified, but there are still around a dozen states and territories where we're looking.
All right. I think I'm not seeing any more questions. So if there are no more, I think we can say thank you to Evan, and I'm sure we are all wishing you great success for the BEAD program.
Well, thank you very much. If anybody has any other questions and you just didn't get them in front of us now, please feel free to reach out to us at BEAD, BEAD at ntia.gov, and we'll get your questions answered as fast as we can. And thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. We're now going to move to a panel discussion with some experts in this field who are engaged in making the most of this broadband funding. I will briefly introduce them. They have fuller bios on our website. And there will also be time for questions at the end of this discussion. So please submit those using that same slide area. First up, we have Paul Garnett. He is the founder and CEO of the Vernonberg Group, which is a consulting firm that helps clients close the broadband gap. He was previously Associate Vice President of CTIA, the Wireless Association. And he was then Attorney Advisor at the FCC, and then went to Microsoft, where he launched the Airband initiative. And then we have Alex Menard, who is the State Legislative Counsel at NCTA, the Internet and Television Association. He was previously at the FCC as well, where he served as Deputy Chief of the Telecommunications Access Policy Division of the Wireline Competition Bureau. And in that role, he led work on getting broadband to high-cost areas. We're also expecting Tamara Holmes, who is the Director of the Office of Broadband at the Virginia Department of Housing and Community Development. I believe she might be having a little trouble getting connected, but hopefully she will be on soon. But just to get started, I'd like to ask the panelists, how's it going? But then by that I mean, how's, as Evan alluded to, NTIA has released this notice of funding opportunity for BEAD last month. And so I'd just like to ask, where are we in light of that? How is the process going from your perspective? Maybe we start with Paul on that.
Okay, sure. Yeah, I'm happy to jump in, and thank you very much, Joe. And it's good to be here with you, Alex. And Evan always does great presentations, yes. And so that was a really good setup to this conversation. So I think I share sort of Evan's, and I think all of us have a perspective around just how incredibly unprecedented this opportunity is. What's happened across the Infrastructure Act and Consolidated Appropriations Act, CARES Act, and other pieces of legislation is that unprecedented funding has been set aside to help us to finally help close the broadband gap in the U.S., both from an availability perspective as well as adoption. And I think the other thing is just sort of a massive change that we're all seeing as a shift of responsibility for completing that task from the federal government to the states and even to local governments. So we have a lot more folks now involved in helping us solve this big problem, which is, I think, an important change and has a lot of ramifications to it. In terms of the challenges that we face, there basically are two main ones. One is the availability gap. So you basically have about, it depends on whose data you believe, and hopefully the FCC's broadband data collection will help to clear this all up. But somewhere between 2 and 13% of the population in the U.S. lacking access to 25/3 broadband, and somewhere between 11 and 22% of the population lacking access to 100 by 20 megabit per second broadband. So that's the unserved and underserved populations in the U.S. But there is this thing called the adoption gap, which is actually even bigger and is, I think, oftentimes overlooked relative to the availability issues. So there are basically about twice as many people in the U.S. who don't adopt broadband than do not have it available to them. So it's important for us from a policy perspective, both at the federal level, state level, and local level, to appropriately apportion resource and attention to both the availability issue and the adoption issue. If you look at the IIJA and the BEAD NOFO that came out recently, really great progress from NTIA. As Alan Davidson noted last week, they were ahead of schedule in getting those NOFOs out, which is pretty impressive. And I think they've appropriately prioritized the tasks. You heard Evan talk earlier about how the prioritizing unserved first, then underserved, then community anchor institutions, and then adoption programs, digital equity programs, but also having flexibility built into it so it doesn't all have to happen at the same time, or it can happen at the same time. In other words, it doesn't all have to be sequential. So I think that's a really important point, and it gives the states as well as subgrantees and counties and local governments some flexibility in terms of how they prioritize when dollars get spent, as long as overall they're on path to achieving the goal. So I mean, in reviewing the different documents that have come out recently, there's a few questions that I have, and maybe we can talk about them today. So one is on this issue of technology neutrality. We saw the question asked earlier, the preference in the NOFO for end-to-end fiber deployments. I've seen a lot of some good clarification from Evan today, as well as from Alan Davidson last week. It feels like there is probably a need for some further clarification from NTIA on this issue. It felt like the NOFO was a bit of a sledgehammer on this issue in terms of promoting fiber end-to-end fiber projects exclusively. But we've heard a lot of sort of scalpel responses to questions. So maybe we can shift a little bit from a hammer to a scalpel on that issue. That would be good. Because I think it is clear that fiber is not going to work everywhere. Another area that I think is something that's looming is the Affordable Connectivity Program, which is $14.3 billion, and how do we make that program sustainable beyond its funding that it's been allocated today? So eventually the dollars will run out, and it is an important program. Evan talked a lot about coordination, collaboration, partnership. I mean, the amount of collaboration and partnership and coordination that's going to need to happen with all of the different programs that are in place now is just unprecedented. So I think that's an area that needs a lot of attention. Another area that sort of I wonder about is sort of commercial sustainability on some of these projects, and how do we make sure that these projects, the ISPs who ultimately are given funding for deployment projects, are commercially and financially sustainable beyond the life of the actual build out itself. And then there's the whole issue of waste, fraud, and abuse. So how do we hold fund recipients accountable for meeting their commitments, and how do we properly incentivize them to beat their commitments? I think overall, it feels like we're at the beginning of a marathon or some kind of a long race. I don't know what's a marathon or ultra marathon or I don't know what it is, but it's like, and I think if you look across sort of different states, different folks who are involved in this, as Evan mentioned earlier, some states, I think Joe, you mentioned as well, there's some states that have been at this for a while, some are new to this, some territories have more experience than others. It feels like you're at the starting line of a marathon, and you've got some folks who have been training for years, and they're just going to, when the starting gun goes off, they're going to take off. But then you've got other folks who just started training 8 weeks ago, and they're probably going to walk the whole thing, and they might not even finish. So we need to make sure. I think sort of the DNF, did not finish, we don't need that at the end of any state or territory's name when all is said and done. So it's extremely important that unlike a marathon, everybody, we want everyone to finish. We want everyone to finish in a decent amount of time, because DNF is just not going to be acceptable. If at the end of this there are people who don't have access to broadband, or we still have low adoption rates, that cannot possibly be a measure of success. So just a few thoughts from me to start the conversation.
Yeah, that's great stuff to have on the table. Alex?
Yeah, and Thanks, Joe and ITIF, for this opportunity. Happy to join you all. Just to echo Paul, kudos to NTIA to getting the NOFO out, ahead of schedule. It's clear that a lot of work went into that, but yeah, nothing else has happened, right? Like, there are all of these decisions that remain to be made, and there are states that are ahead, and so have started making those decisions, but it's going to be a while. Certainly the amount of coordination and consulting that even Evan just described now, is all of those things take time. I think the NOFO did a commendable job on recognizing that the statute gave very clear direction to NTIA to start with the unserved, make sure that that's taken care of, and the hierarchy between that unserved, underserved, and the other uses. I think, this isn't the first program out of the gate. There are already billions of dollars that states and localities have been using, and the federal government itself has already been spending on broadband. And so, again, I think it was really good that the NOFO recognized that and specifically called out areas that are subject to binding commitments to deploy as not being eligible for BEAD. And absent just a massive amount of transparency and coordination between all levels of government, and allowing ISPs that are already getting funds to kind of communicate with each other, you're going to have some inefficiencies or duplicative support going to some of these areas if you don't keep your eye on where all the moving parts are.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think that's a question there about duplication. Like, is there a way for states to adjust for that? I know, a lot of this stuff is other programs run by the federal government that maybe states don't have as much of a say in. What would be your advice to states to try to deal with that duplication issue?
So Congress sort of identified this issue and required the FCC to come up with a map that shows where all of the federal support is going to be spent. Unfortunately, that statutory deadline to the FCC is later in time than the first iteration of the broadband data maps. But certainly that, from the federal government, that data should be out there, right? The FCC publishes, including shapefiles for all of the RDOF winners that have been authorized. That could easily be layered on top of the broadband data maps. Hopefully the eligible entities, the states, know where they have spent money through ARPA, through their own state funding, and are able to account for that when they put together their initial plans. I think the wild card might be the localities. They got direct funding through ARPA, and I'm not sure what data set there is, but if they are, coordinating between the state and local levels, that should be certainly a piece of information that's being shared.
Definitely. Paul, any comment on that?
No, I think Alex, you pretty well covered it. I think it's definitely going to be an issue, and the last thing we want to have happen is basically duplicate support going to the same locations because of lack of coordination. So that's why this whole coordination role is just so critically important, and NTIA plays a central role in all of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a good point. I guess the next question is, what advice do you have to states when they're trying to pick, these providers come to them to be subgrantees? What should they be looking for? There's billions of dollars out there. That's going to invite all kinds of people to come out of the woodwork looking for it. How can states sort of sort through which projects are good, which projects are bad, and which ones, are just going to be, take the money and not actually finish?
Yeah, I mean, this is a tough one, and of course, unlike Evan, I haven't run a state broadband office, so I come at this probably from a little bit more of a commercial perspective. I have been involved in a lot of projects and invested in a lot of internet service providers and other companies. So I kind of come at this from that perspective, and if I'm looking at a project or at a network operator, and I'm thinking about investing in them, I want to make sure that they've got a good plan in place. It's it ticks all the boxes from an administrative perspective, but also from a technical and commercial perspective. Honestly, I at the end of the day, when you do these kind of investments, it comes down to the people, and you're really betting on the people, as in the company and their track record, and past is prologue. And, if someone has done something well in the past, it's likely they'll do it well in the future. If someone has never done anything in the past before that's anything like this, chances are it's going to be hard for them to do it well the first time, at least. I've certainly seen that in my experience. So I think, and also being realistic about okay, someone shows up and they only have, let's say, 5,000, customers under passed by their network, and they want to go and get a grant to bring service to 500,000 customers. It's pretty unlikely a company that small can pull it off that quickly. So what's their capacity to actually pull it off? So I think all of those factors will come into play, and I think it's just as it would for an investor, I think it should also for a state broadband office when they're looking at proposals that are coming into them. Is this really a believable proposal, and do we really believe that this company can pull it off?
Yeah, and I think I agree with everything Paul said. Certainly, looking at experienced providers who have done this before should be top of mind for the states. And I think Congress properly identified that the subgrantees, including a matching fund, certainly is a demonstration that entity has skin in the game and will follow through. And I think there's a couple of places where the NOFO contemplates states waiving that requirement for certain classes of providers, and in a lot of instances, it seems like those are the providers that don't have the experience. So I'd be a little concerned about states, taking a risk on new entrants that don't have experience and also don't have skin in the game. I think that's not a great recipe for success.
Yeah, I think those are good points. I think one of the things we proposed in our 10 Commandments report is saying, hey, don't write a check to these ISPs when they come and promise you the world until they actually deliver the world. And so I wonder, what do you think about that kind of requirement? It's something I go back and forth between thinking it's like some sort of radical proposal and also just, it's a normal thing. If you buy something, you don't pay until someone gives it to you. That's sort of seems like a fairly straightforward thing, and that you would then sort of harness the power of credit markets to say, either you have to be a company that is, financially well off enough to be able to support its promises in the first place, or you can get a loan for it, which then is saying, look, I have a guaranteed check from the government if I deliver on my promises. And if a bank is saying, well, we don't believe you will, then that's, maybe a red flag for a state.
Yeah, I mean, I would. I don't know that I'd go quite that far. If I'm being honest here.
No.
I think and I think these are capital intensive projects, and cash flows don't come quickly. It takes a little bit of time for you to start to deploy a network and generate revenues off it. So I think asking a network operator to basically put all the cash up front, take all the risk, build the whole network, and then wait for a check to be written for the cost of the portion of the cost of the network that the government's willing to pay, maybe taking things a bit too far. But I do think that there are things that program administrators can do to incentivize network operators to meet milestones, do milestone-based payments, or maybe even incentive-based payments if they meet or beat milestones of different types. I think those are things that one could look at that I think would probably achieve some of the similar goals that you just described.
Yeah, I think I don't know of any other broadband funding program that's been structured that way. But I do think Paul is right that there's a lot of ways to build a program, and one of them is incent compliance, incent performance, and there's probably different ways to do that, but that's certainly an integral part because you want those funding recipients to perform, especially in these areas, right? We're asking companies to go into economically challenging areas that they wouldn't enter without this government subsidy. And so it's going to be hard. And it was, heartening to hear Evan say that they were understanding of potential delays that could be outside the control of the provider. But certainly you want to give them as many incentives as possible to perform.
Yeah, that's definitely an important part of it. Paul mentioned the technology neutrality component of this, and how, there does seem to be in the NOFO, at least as written, a preference for fiber-based deployments. And I wonder, is there a risk that we end up putting money into fiber? It seems like we have billions and billions of dollars. Why not just buy fiber? But we can, $1 billion is a lot, but it's not infinite money. And that, do we risk putting all our money into uneconomical fiber deployments at a time when low Earth orbit satellite systems are coming online and fixed wireless for home broadband is becoming more and more popular? That we, right at the time when technology was poised to fix a lot of these areas that were uneconomical to serve before, we spend a bunch of money on fiber that may not have been needed.
Yeah, I mean, not only that, but just the deployment of hybrid networks. So, that you could have an ISP that wants to deploy a primarily fiber-based network, but in some locations in the service area that they're proposing to serve, they want to mix in some different types of technologies, maybe not even in the last mile, maybe even the last 100 yards of some kind of a gigabit speed fixed wireless technology. So I think, as I said earlier, I think that this is an area ripe for clarification, and I think that the way that it was written, I mean, who knows? I'm not on the inside. I mean, it could be that they were in a rush to get something out, and they want to come up with the basic structure first, and then do some further refinement. But what I can say from my experience is that the options that ISPs now have to deploy in networks has never been better in terms of technologies, right? So fiber certainly is a great technology, and it should be deployed in a lot of places, but it shouldn't be the exclusive technology that we utilize. There's a lot of great technology that's been developed in the fixed wireless space. That whole area has matured incredibly in the last decade. Plus, as you mentioned, there are low Earth orbit satellite services that are either now in pilot or will soon be seeing the next launches of satellites from other operators, and that's wonderful for this whole ecosystem and for consumers. I think one of the dangers of this sort of over emphasis on fiber is that obviously there's a risk to cost to the overall system, and you end up spending way more money than you can. And $42.5 billion sounds like a lot, but it is a finite amount of resource. So that could run out if all we do is spend money on fiber networks, and then we have nothing left over for things like adoption programs. And also, I just think it's not great for U.S. innovation. I mean, there's a lot of great American companies that are doing really cool things in things like 5G and Open RAN, and as I said, satellites and other forms of fixed wireless. And the last thing we want to be doing is signaling to the market that that's not acceptable, and that's really harmful to these companies that have put a lot of investment-backed risk against creating a solution for a problem that we all know definitely exists.
Yeah, I'd just say I think in almost all cases I'd expect our member companies to deploy fiber wherever they bid on BEAD funding, but we fully recognize that there's going to be areas that fixed wireless or satellite is going to be the right answer. And a lot of that's going to depend on where and how NTIA helps the states set that extremely high cost threshold, which Evan mentioned they're working on. But is another part of this, like what else is coming in this program, right? Where an individual state sets that threshold could have a significant impact on the type of program it runs. Yeah.
So if the extremely high cost threshold is set at an amount that's extremely high, you're going to run out of money pretty quickly. But if it's set at a lower level and then above that amount, you're not going to go above a certain amount and say, well, if it's going to cost, let's say, $10,000 per household to serve a customer in that service area, we're going to consider other technologies. Maybe there's some further refinement that can happen along those lines that I think would really help this. Yeah,
that makes sense. I think I want to turn to the topic of government-owned networks. I think that's something that, you hear some talk that from some people who almost want to prioritize that above all else, that it should be, the gold standard for networks. And I think at ITIF, we sort of looked at the track record of government-owned networks and said, not very good, that they often end up not delivering what they promise and then sort of poisoning the well of competition in a place that maybe could have been served economically by a private provider. And so I wanted to ask, maybe, we think maybe there's a case sometimes as a last resort to go to a government-owned network. What is this allure that government-owned networks seem to have as almost a first resort? And what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I think as an association, we have an opinion that's pretty close to what you just said, Joe. There may be instances where a government-owned network is the right answer, but in most cases, I think we look at their track record and it doesn't seem great. I was reading just this morning about another town who, got sold on a project and was, given a break even, you need to sign up this number of customers to break even. And it was like off by fivefold. And so I think part of it is, there's a group of people who are going around whispering in cities and counties' ears saying, this is the perfect solution, give us a couple $100,000, we'll give you a glossy report. And it's always the same answer. And I think, we just need to be careful. Folks who are the decision makers in this program need to be careful about, this goes back to who's the qualified, experienced provider, who is going to be able to actually deliver, and are, the people pushing this government-owned network solution being honest about what the actual costs of the project are, what the likelihood of folks signing up is, the rates they're going to have to charge, and how are you going to maintain it going forward, right? Like, who's going to run your cybersecurity program for your network in the long term? And so there's a lot of questions to be answered. And I think if folks are being honest, in most cases, it comes out that it's not the right answer.
When I got started in telecom in the early 90s, I worked on telecom privatizations. And so we had about 100 years of government ownership of most telcos around the world. And when the Soviet Union collapsed in the late 1980s, that sort of created a wave of privatization, a lot of industry, including telecom companies, and that was at a time when you would call up for phone service and wait 3 or 4 years to get your phone service hooked up. So I think there's a bit of history here about with government ownership of telecommunications and telephony, and it wasn't always great. I mean, I guess in theory they provided service to everybody, but not very well. And I do think, to Alex's point, I think there is a lot of sort of like maybe historical amnesia here, and folks coming along with ideas about, hey, maybe you should consider doing this. I wouldn't say the answer is never. I think and there's a lot of reason behind why local governments are looking at this. This frustration, right? People have not brought broadband to their communities, and that's legitimate concern. The question is that the answer? And are there other steps that those local governments can take to incentivize operators who before weren't interested in coming in to come in? Maybe there are things they can be doing around local zoning regulations and the like. Can they be doing more on adoption programs? Can they things like the Affordable Connectivity Program, but other kinds of adoption programs that can help to incentivize companies to enter into certain markets where they might not have been attractive before. So I wouldn't say that the answer is never, but I think that's definitely a lot of steps along the way that I would take before I would take that drastic a step and get into the telecom business yourselves as a local government. Because once you've done that, that's a big step, and that's taking on a lot of responsibility that maybe you're not ready for.
Yeah. I want to pose to, maybe starting with you, Alex, the question I put to Evan about supply chain and labor market issues. Is that something that your members have been running into, and what do you think? What role do you think that's going to play as we get all this money to roll out networks?
I think it's definitely something that they've been mindful of, and something that they've been trying to manage. And I guess to go back to, picking experienced providers. There are, groups of folks within the companies that are trying to run mitigation on both of those issues and make sure that it isn't something that flows through to the customer experience. Query what these new entrants are going to be able to do as far as getting access to the supplies. And then I think the other issue that's kind of related to this that we certainly have an interest in is the Buy American provisions. And we've heard that there are waivers contemplated on a case-by-case basis as opposed to a blanket waiver as the administration did back under BTOP. But we're still, again, waiting for whatever additional guidance NTIA is going to release on those, but certainly interested because I think, maybe not to the country's credit, but there are certain components that you just can't buy here, or certainly can't buy in the amount that you're going to need to fix this problem within the near term. So again, it goes back to, if NTIA's primary goal is getting the unserved served, there are going to be some implementation challenges along the way, but hopefully they keep their eye on that goal. And I think together we could all execute on that.
I guess just one thing to add on I'm hearing a lot of the same things from my clients as well, Alex. But I think just one other thing just to add on the supply chain issue is that, again, I hate to harp on this end-to-end fiber issue, but if you're signaling to the marketplace that the only thing that's going to be acceptable is end-to-end fiber, then that just puts further strain on that supply and further fuels inflation in that space and basically pulls demand away from other technologies that you might have considered.
Yeah, that's a good point as well. I think we're coming up towards the end of our time. I remind everyone to get any questions they have in using that Slido link on the bottom of the screen. But I would put to the panelists, just, is there anything that you've seen, anything like specific things as you've been working with states throughout this process that you've seen that's a particularly good thing, like, oh, other states should try to do that, or anything that's particularly bad that seems to be popular out in the states that maybe would be good to explain why?
Paul, do you want to go? Or
No, go ahead, Alex.
Okay. I'm actually, it's unfortunate Dr. Holmes couldn't join us because I think Virginia is an example of a state that has, focused on the unserved, run a competitive process. We didn't really get into how states are going to pick these beyond, who will be eligible. But, one of the great things about making providers compete is you actually force them to reveal what their true need is on the subsidy. And so there's a number of states out there that have been doing that. A number of states that have come up with novel programs to solve this, right? It's not, as Evan said, it's not one size fits all solution, but, line extension programs. Indiana has started running a program that a couple other states have where customers can self-identify and then providers bid on extending service to those individual locations, because a lot of these unserved areas aren't going to be, a full neighborhood. It's going to be someone who lives down the end of a lane, and it doesn't make sense to build a whole network just for that person, but maybe there's two providers nearby who can compete to extend to that. So I think those are a couple of things that come to mind on that.
I think just to further build upon the Virginia example, they've done a really good job of leveraging other funding sources. I know we spent a lot of time today talking about IIJA and BEAD, but they're well on their way already before they've had to spend a single dime of infrastructure funding. So I think that's definitely a good path to follow. Use all of the funding mechanisms that have been made available to you. The money is finite. It's a lot, but it's finite. So leverage all of those funding sources that you have, and then that will free up funding beyond just the availability issue and more on adoption. And I think our view is that the adoption issue is in many ways the more intractable challenge.
Yeah.
There's a lot of complexity around adoption. There's a lot of reasons why people don't adopt. Even making something free sometimes is not enough. We see, as Evan mentioned earlier, adoption impacting certain groups, low income, the elderly, persons with disabilities, certain ethnic groups, people in rural areas, and also just some underrepresented groups even within communities. So having more funding available, freeing up funding for these digital equity and adoption programs, and catering that programming to specific populations and specific locations, I think is something we're going to see emulated more and more.
Yeah, I think, we all know how to build networks, and it's certainly harder in some areas than others, but it's still building a network. I don't think we've fully answered why someone doesn't subscribe to broadband. Right. And as Paul said, it can be intractable. I mean, I know my member companies have spent the last decade trying to get folks to sign up, and Paul's right. Even if it's free, they don't necessarily do it. So you got to teach them why they need to do it. And all of these things take money, and time and effort. So it's going to be, and it's a problem that's tenfold the unserved problem. So.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's great. That's a great point on where we need to go, even if we have build out to everybody, adoption is still lingering there. All right, well, I think that might be a good place to leave it. Obviously, we have not answered all the questions that we're going to have throughout this process, but the process is underway, and I think hopefully getting started on the right foot is a way to make sure that it bears fruit in the future. So thank you to all my panelists and to Evan, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.